What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim. We're going to be talking about the Big Ten coaching rankings for the year 2023 heading into this season. If you like the podcast, make sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Google, Spotify. Make sure you are locked in. Leave a review. Leave some feedback. Share on Twitter and Instagram. Make sure you're following us on those pages at the Big Ten Football Talk handle. And then, of course, if you want to send me an email, bigtenfootballtalk@gmail.com. I was inspired by On3. They had a rankings of coaching in the Big Ten. And I thought with the season fast approaching, I thought I would start kind of the post-July 4th craziness of information. I figured I'd start with the coaching. I'll be starting some other things after the 17th of July. That's where we're going to be away. And then after that, we'll be doing some more regular podcasts. We'll probably do another round of best case, worst case, where if you remember a year ago, I went through the best case and worst case scenario for each team in the Big Ten, and we'll probably break it down via Phil Steele's breakdown of, we'll go from his projected worst in each division all the way to his projected best in each division. And we'll just say, okay, what's a realistic worst case and what's a realistic best case for each team? I really had fun doing that series last year. We'll do that as well. But that won't be until closer to the middle to end July. After July 17th, we'll start working on that. And at that point, we'll get to more of a regular rhythm of these podcasts, 1 to 2 a week, until we get to the beginning of the season. Looking forward to it. It's going to be a fun year. But let's talk coaching. We'll do the bottom 7, and then we'll take a quick break, and then I'll come back with the top 7, if you will. And I just want to give you a sense of where I am in my headspace. I am doing a little bit of what have you done for me lately? And so I'm a little harsher on certain coaches than others because they have not proven it lately. And you'll see that very early in this. You also, while I will take into account previous coaching stops, to be fair, I'm actually a bit skeptical of all 3 new coaches. Just as a rule of, just so you're aware, there are 3 new coaches in the Big Ten this year. You have Ryan Walters at Purdue, Matt Rhule at Nebraska, Kirk Ferentz is certainly not new. Luke Fickell. Goodness, I can't believe I just said Kirk Ferentz is new. He's only been at Iowa for 20-some years. He's the longest tenured coach in the Big Ten. Good job, Zach. We're starting out with a banger. All right. So 3 new coaches in the Big Ten. My guess is you won't be surprised who's at the top. So, but I'm going to get right into it. 14th, last in the Big Ten, Ryan Walters. Ryan Walters at Purdue. Of course, Ryan Walters was the stellar defensive coordinator for Illinois last year. To be fair to Ryan, the reason why he's last is he's never been a head coach. And so it's hard for me to put you anywhere other than 14th, especially because, honestly, all the other coaches in the Big Ten, like, none of them are awful. right? There are certainly weaknesses, and then there's just the reality that certain programs are just going to struggle year in and year out. But honestly, the coaching in the Big Ten, it's not your father's Big Ten. Like, no offense to Jerry DiNardo, I think he does a decent job on the Big Ten Network. Not a good coach, right? Like Danny Hope, who used to be at Purdue, Darrell Hazel, who used to be at Purdue. Trying to think of other guys. Like there are just certain coaches where you're like, they're dead on arrival. There is none on this list. You have good coaches, you have I think mediocre coaches, but there's no bad coach. And so Ryan Walters, I think he's a rising star in the industry. He obviously turned around Illinois' defense in a major way, developed some serious talent in that back end. But there's two reasons why I have Ryan Walters here. First, he's new. The other is I just think it's going to be a hard job losing a lot of the infrastructure that was there that made Purdue and Jeff Brom so dynamic. And you saw the effects of that in their blowout loss in their bowl game. Purdue, remember, people will say, well, Purdue was going to be outmatched. Well, remember, Purdue went toe-to-toe and beat Tennessee in a bowl game the year before without their top four receivers, right? Like, they had all their guys either leaving or get injured in that game. And, like, that Tennessee team parlayed that loss into a lot of playoff conversation and then a blowout win over Clemson. At the end of the year. They beat Alabama. And so the vibe of Purdue is very, like, I know there's excitement internally, but just looking at how they ended last year, they got beat badly by Michigan in the Big Ten title game. And then Jeff Brom, while I think everybody knew he really wanted to go to Louisville, I still think it was a bit of a blow, and then you're losing Aiden O'Connell. I mean, he was going to go anyway, but just the way that everybody left, it felt like it sucked the air out of the program a little bit. So they do have a key transfer, or they have several key transfers. Hudson Card is coming over from Texas, who I think he's certainly an upgrade over what they have. Graham Harrell coming to be the offensive coordinator. Offensive-minded guy. So I like what Ryan Walters is doing. I'm not sure it's going to work out year one. I think there's certainly some opportunities for him to progress up these rankings. I just think it's a rough start to year one. And when you have no outright bad coaches, like I can't believe I forgot this. There's no Scott Frost on the list. Nebraska fans rejoice everywhere, right? It's hard for me to put I can't put Ryan Walters anywhere else because he's never been a head coach. So he's 14. 13, I think, is pretty obvious. It's Tom Allen in Indiana. And I promise I'm not trying to be against the Indiana schools. Amazingly, if this were 2020, I think Tom Allen would be a lot higher on this list. But the reality is 2020 just feels so much more like a fluke. They had a lot of momentum. They had a lot of recruiting momentum. They had Dasan McCullough, who committed over Ohio State. Now he's transferred. They had Michael Penix. He transferred over to Washington. So the momentum is gone. Right, 2019, 2020, they had a combined record of 14-7, right? They're 6-18 since then, the last 2 years. And it just seems like they have lost all the momentum and they're back to being the Indiana that they were, which is a shame because I thought Tom Allen was actually doing a really good job of turning that program around. But because he's lost the momentum, I would be very surprised if he survives the year. Because at some point you just acknowledge, okay, you've peaked. And I think Tom Allen peaked. I don't think it's anything against Tom. I actually think he's a really good coach. I just think at some point you just realize, yeah, I think you got about as far as you did. And I think you're done. So I could be wrong. Maybe Tom Allen gets a couple of key wins, but I really doubt it. Just the way that the recruiting has fallen off, the momentum has really fallen off. So he's 13. 12 is probably my biggest surprise on this list. It's Pat Fitzgerald at Northwestern. And I feel guilty putting him this low because I think I think he's the second longest tenured head coach in the Big Ten. Been there since 2006. And he's been, for Northwestern, he has been excellent. Like, by no means am I on the bandwagon to say Pat Fitzgerald should be fired. But I think similarly with Tom Allen, there's a lot of questions about, did Pat Fitzgerald peak and do they need fresh blood? I'm not advocating that they fire Pat yet, but, it used to be they were a perennial bowl team, or if they didn't, they were 5-7, right? Which for Northwestern, no offense to Northwestern fans, but like that was pretty good, right? If that was your worst season in 5 years. 2020, they were 7-2. 2019, 2021, and 2022, they've gone 3-9, 3-9, 1-11. And they've lost to some bad teams. I mean, they've lost to Miami of Ohio last year. They lost to, I think, Southern Illinois. Was it Southern Illinois or Southern Alabama that they lost to? They've lost to some very bad teams. They lost to a 3-9 Duke. They lost to 4-8 Stanford. So they're playing non-conference games against teams probably with equal talent, and they're losing every one of them. And then just forget about it in Big Ten play. Like, they've been awful in Big Ten play. So I have a tough time seeing how Pat Fitzgerald gets back some positive momentum, especially with the trajectory of the rest of the conference. Now, if anyone can turn it around, I think it's Pat. But I'm not convinced that it's gonna work out. Just the way it's gone the past 4 years. So I've got him at 12. 11, I have Greg Schiano. I think he is probably a year behind Pat Fitzgerald in that question. Like, is Greg, has he peaked? A lot of Rutgers fans are like, Greg Schiano is going to return us to the glory days. And you have to remember, Greg Schiano brought Rutgers to the glory days in a Big East conference, which no longer had to deal with Miami, Virginia Tech, Boston College. Like, their main competition was West Virginia and Louisville. Which, by the way, they're not great programs anymore now that they're in bigger conferences. Like, Louisville has its years. West Virginia sometimes is above 500 in this past decade. But, like, that's who the cream of the crop was in the Big East. And at least currently, Greg has to deal with Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Michigan State, Maryland, all in its own division. And then sometimes they get crossovers with Wisconsin and Iowa. And, like, it's Rutgers will benefit from going divisionless. But even then, you're still adding USC and UCLA. So it's not like Rutgers' program profile is going up. If anything, it's going down. And so I don't know what you do with, like, I think Greg's a good coach, but I think a lot of his merits as a coach are back from when Rutgers' heyday was, when they were peaking in a Big East conference where, like, their main competition is now 500 in the Big 12 or is maybe 8-4 in the ACC. So I just don't know what to make of Greg. in this current run. I will say, I think recruiting has gotten a little better overall, although this past year they signed their worst class under Schiano, 59th nationally, 13th in the Big Ten. That was a statistic quoted by On3. And so they have some talent. I just don't know how it's going to stack up, especially with the way other teams are recruiting. So overall, I think he's a good man for that job. I just don't know if Rutgers is going to get any higher. And like, you would need a truly transformational coach. So I've got Greg at 11, Mike Locksley of Maryland at 10. I think Mike Locksley's weakness is what keeps him at 10, which is I don't think he develops well. Case in point, he had 3 wide receivers declare for the draft. One of them was a 5-star in the name of Raheem Jarrett. And if you heard me in the podcast, I kept saying there are 3 NFL receivers on this team in Demas, Copeland, and Jarrett. A lot of talent. None of them got drafted. And that's been maybe my one of my 2 knocks on Locksley. He doesn't develop talent well, particularly on the offense, which is the area of the ball that he's supposed to be proficient in. And he's not a great X's and O's coach. Great recruiter. For Maryland to get some of the guys that they get. And listen, he's gotten some of the right pieces on his coaching staff, right? Deontay Banks, I think it's Jacorian Bennett, 2 draft picks on the back end. Like, he's got some of the right guys in the right places on that staff. They went 8-5 this past year. So they've been competitive. They were competitive with Michigan. They're competitive with Ohio State. But I never feel like Mike Locksley is going to be able to get over the hump because he fails in the ways that I think other guys may not recruit as well as Mike Locksley, but they develop better. And better development will always win out over good recruiting and bad development. Now, obviously, you want good recruiting and good development. But so that being said, I think Mike Locksley has positioned Maryland to be a perennial over 500 team, which is quite honestly in the division setup that the Big Ten currently has. That's pretty good because, again, you're dealing with 4 teams that majority of the time are top 25 caliber, top 10 caliber teams, right? And Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and then Michigan State is often a top 25 program. So Locksley at 10, Mel Tucker at 9. Now, before everyone, I feel like this is a tough spot. And so before everyone jumps on me for either saying you have him rated too low or you have rated him too high. For the people who are saying you've rated him too high, just remember he had a historic 2021. Everybody knew Michigan State was going to be awful in 2020. And then in 2021, I think I had them winning a single game. And he went 11-2 and won a New Year's Six Bowl. And he did it, and they did it without their best player, right? And after they lost Kenneth Walker, after they lost a lot of their transfers, I said on this podcast that Michigan State was going to take a dip. And it was very likely that it would be worse than people expected. And it was. And people are freaking out. And people are like, oh, he pulled off the heist of the century in getting paid $95 million in 10 years. Listen. That was expected. I don't think people expected 5-7. But they weren't going to go 11-2 again. And I think in a lot of ways, Mel Tucker is feeling the brunt of expectations raised too high too quickly. if I'm honest, it's a little bit of what Jim Harbaugh had to deal with when he first got to the Big Ten, because Michigan was a mess, right? And then he goes 10-3 with a bowl win, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, national championship or bust. And then 2017, 2 years later, they go 8-4, 7-5, I forget what it was, and everybody's like, oh, he stinks. It's like, no. They were an inch away from getting to the playoff and winning the Big Ten in 2016. And then they took some steps back because Michigan was not the program that everybody thought it was, because Jim Harbaugh raised the bar in an extraordinary way his first year. That's what Mel Tucker did in his second year. And so for people saying he's too high, you need to understand Mel is being judged by the bar that he set in 2021. And that's not fair to say, well, he was terrible last year, so he's not good. That being said, I think this is a prove-it year. And I'm curious to see what happens with just with the transfer portal. Again, Peyton Thorne is gone, which might be a good thing. It may not be a good thing. But I think Mel Tucker is a good coach, but we're really going to see, where does he land in the pecking order here? Can he become more consistent and be a more of a perennial player in that Big Ten East? We're going to round out the bottom 7 with Matt Rhule in Nebraska. The reason why I have Matt Rhule 8th is because, for a couple reasons. One is I do think he has a track record of reviving programs. Obviously, Temple and Baylor, right? Baylor, he went from 1-11 to 11-3 in 3 years. Temple, he went from 2-10 to a couple of 10-win seasons. So I think that gives him a little bit more street cred, despite the fact that he didn't do well at Carolina. He's also been recruiting pretty well, especially considering how much of a firestorm Nebraska has been the past few years. So I like Matt Rhule. Before I can put him higher, I want to see how he does. I just don't think I can put him any higher. I think if he does well, I think you could easily see him above PJ Fleck, above a couple other guys. But right now, 8 is about as high as I'm willing to put Matt. Let's take a break, and then I'll come back with the top 7. Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify, and when you want to take conversations with your fans to the next level, Q&A and polls are the best way to get them talking. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions, and best of all, it's totally free. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started today. Welcome back to the Big Ten Football Talk podcast. Top 7 coaches, starting with the row the boat man, PJ Fleck, Minnesota. PJ is hard for me, and I honestly struggled a bit with 10 through 7, like Mike Locksley, Mel Tucker, Matt Rhule, and PJ Fleck, because all of them have, in my view, a pronounced weakness, but also some real strengths. Now, Matt Rhule, I don't know what I wouldn't say he has a pronounced weakness. We just don't know enough yet. And we don't know what he's going to do at Nebraska. Mel Tucker, I think we're really going to see how he's going to do after this. Mike Locksley, I don't think he develops talent well and does X's and O's well, but I think he recruits better probably than all 4 of these coaches in this area. Mike Loxley didn't have a great recruiting year this year, so I'm speaking more generally. But PJ has, I think, a lot of good things going with Minnesota, right? They run the ball. They have a good identity. They're 4-0 in bowl games. They had that one really good season in 2019 where Tanner Morgan, he had a great season, 10 wins, I think 11 wins actually, and a win in a New Year's Day bowl. So there's a lot of good that PJ Fleck does, and yet they have these stinker games that just boggle my mind. The loss to Bowling Green, and then the opportunity to take the West by the horns, and then they lose to Iowa, who Iowa can't score a darn point. And it's these like stub your toe games that PJ Fleck routinely has that make me kind of be like, I don't understand. But Minnesota is more relevant in the Big Ten than they've been since the early 2000s. Like, Minnesota has been in the West fight each of the past, besides COVID, each of the past 4 years. And it hasn't felt dumb to say it. And that's a credit to PJ Fleck really building momentum at that program. So do I think that he has been a great coach? No. Do I think he's been a good coach? Yeah. I think he's been good for Minnesota. I think he's really raised the profile. And remember, he's raising the profile in a much tougher Big Ten, right? Like, this isn't the Big Ten back in 2009 when Tim Brewster was the coach and he was going 1-11 when nobody could throw the ball in the conference, right? Like, that's not what's going on. Like, this is a good conference. And he's done very well. 2 9-4 seasons back to back. But I think to be higher on this list, he needs to be more consistent. Speaking of consistency, number 6, Kirk Ferentz. Again, what have you done for me lately? Well, what he's done for us lately is they scored 7 points against Southern Illinois. 7? Via 2 safeties and a field goal. Josh Pate had an interesting question. What if Iowa had an offense? And that's it. What if Iowa had an offense? They might be the best team in the Big Ten if they had an offense. That's maybe a little hyperbolic. But I mean, they went 8-5 where they lost games to teams that scored 10 points and 9 points. That's just bonkers to me. And so for that alone, I can't put Kirk Ferentz higher than 6. Because, quite honestly, Iowa has talent. For all the hand-wringing about Iowa and they don't recruit, they can't get the recruits. They develop talent really well, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. But they've had really good tight ends, right? Sam Laporta just went, I think, 2nd round in the draft. They have good offensive players. But they haven't had a good quarterback in forever. And we're very excited when Iowa has a quarterback that can throw a good pass. And I'll be the first to admit, I thought Spencer Petras was decent for a while. And part of that is because I'm just used to bad quarterback play at Iowa. And just the offense, it's broken. And yet, Kirk Ferentz churns out winning season after winning season after winning season. If you look at his record the past, several years, 8-5, 10-4, 6-2, that was the COVID year, 10-3, 9-4, 8-5, 8-5, 12-2. ranked in the top 25. So on one hand, you can't put him lower than 6. I think people might argue that you can't put him lower than 5. There's a reason why he's not in my top 5. I just think if you are supposedly this good, but you are irrelevant in the conference race, then I think you got to get docked for it. Because I think if Kirk Ferentz made a couple of changes, I think Iowa actually could be a Big Ten contender perennially. And I think they could go toe-to-toe with teams like Michigan and Ohio State and Penn State. They can beat them. Like, they've beat Ohio State, as recently as 2017. They've beat Penn State. They've beat Michigan. So it's not about... Like, honestly, if they had an offense, they would probably be in the Big Ten championship contender list, not dark horse contender. Or not dark horse list. So I've got Kirk at 6. At 5, I have Luke Fickell. I love Luke. And the more I think about him at Wisconsin, he's bringing in Tanner Mordecai from SMU for his starting quarterback, bringing in an air raid offense, Phil Longo, the offensive coordinator. I really like what he's doing. It is one thing to go, it's one thing to do it at Cincinnati in the AAC, which is it is a tougher conference than people give credit for, right? And when they had their heyday, it wasn't when teams were weak, At times, 4 top 25 teams in that conference, which is saying something. And yet, I look at how he does against the better teams. I feel like he coaches scared. I think he coaches not to lose. I think you saw that against Georgia in the Peach Bowl, where honestly they had Georgia on the ropes the entire game. And listen, this is Georgia the year before they became almost dynastic, right? Alabama, they just played like they didn't want to get blown out. And that is my lasting memory of Luke when he coached Ohio State. Now, to be fair to him, he's had a lot of time to grow since his interim year at Ohio State. I don't think he should be judged much by his years at Ohio State. But I just wonder, what's he going to do now in a conference that, quite honestly, it's not the SEC, but it's darn near close. You just have the parity of the league. Everybody's raised their game. Everybody's raised their game. And so I just don't know how Luke is going to do in a revamped Big Ten. I think he's certainly set up well, both from a schedule standpoint, and I think he's done well in managing the roster. But especially as he gets outside of division play, how is that going to work for him? So I feel like I have a wait and see approach with Luke. 4, I have Brett Bielema. And a lot of this has to do with the fact of what he's doing at a program that honestly has been more like Rutgers or Indiana, and more than what someone might do with Wisconsin. So Brett comes into Illinois, immediately has an impact, immediately upsets Nebraska, which I know Nebraska wasn't good in that game, but he came in and he didn't let one of the worst rosters, not just in the Big Ten, but in all of college football, he didn't let that hinder him from making an impact. He went 5-7, almost made a bowl game when he had no business doing that in 2021. And then he went 8-5 and had a majorly contested bowl game with most of his top players sitting out. took Michigan to the wire. He's had a couple of major upsets. So Brett knows the Big Ten. He's always done well in the Big Ten. He has established an identity with Illinois. He develops talent well. I just think Brett, I think he is going to be, how do I say this? I think out of all the coaches in the West, I think the coach that actually will do the best, especially as they go divisionless, out of the West schools, it won't be Luke, it'll be Brett. Based on what I've seen so far. Now, can that change? Absolutely. But I really like Brett in the Big Ten, what he's done. And he's been successful recently. I think he's developed players well. I think he's doing a good job. He's really building the recruiting momentum there. So, all about Brett. All about Brett. Top 3, I think, probably won't surprise anybody. I have James Franklin 3. I know some people will have a question mark because I think sometimes people think that James Franklin is doing less with more. But I think over the past couple years, he's really done a good job of raising the bar recruiting and getting the program to be more, I think, more on par with more nationally. And so, yes, he's lost to Ohio State several of the last times. Yes, he's lost to Michigan several of the last times. Yes, 2020 and 2021 were not good. Although I think 2020 is excusable. 2021, I think they got decimated by injuries, and I think the Iowa loss in 2021 is what happened with Indiana in 2020. Like, they lost to Indiana, they let Indiana beat them 5 times. Iowa beat Penn State off of an injury to Sean Clifford, and then they essentially let Iowa beat them 3 straight times. So is that excusable? No, but I thought Penn State came back in a big way last year. And I think if anybody can unseat the Big Two, Ohio State and Michigan, it's James Franklin and Penn State. Now, he's got to prove it, right? The last time he proved it was 2016. But I think with the roster he's constructed, I think he might do it this year. That might be a little bit of a spoiler alert in where I'm going for my Big Ten projections. He's got the quarterback. So presumably, in Rhule. He's got maybe the best backfield in the Big Ten. He's got a mammoth at left tackle for the offensive line in Ole Fashanu. You know that they have a great defense with Manny Diaz coordinating that thing. So I think James Franklin has built this program to at least compete and maybe be on par with the Big Two. So, which leads me to my top 2. Number 2 is Ryan Day at Ohio State. This is a very different conversation if a kicker's name, I'm blanking on his name. If the kicker makes a field goal at midnight in the Peach Bowl, right? Because Ohio State wasn't going to lose to TCU if they beat Georgia. It just wasn't going to happen. But instead, Ryan Day and Ohio State lost 2 straight. They lost 2 straight to Michigan after not beating Michigan or not losing to Michigan for several years. I think, and I've been very critical about Ryan Day, and part of that's my own fandom. We need to understand a couple things. Michigan's better than they were several years ago. And quite honestly, Ohio State's better than they were several years ago. I was listening to a podcast, Buckeye Talk by Cleveland.com, Doug Lesmerises, Stephen Means, and Nathan Baird. and they rewatched the 2016 Ohio State-Michigan game, and I thought they made a really good point. If both those teams played their current versions of themselves, their 2022 versions, the 2016 teams would have gotten blown out. Because you had Wilton Speight at quarterback for Michigan, and you had a mentally compromised J.T. Barrett playing quarterback without any good receiver. Like, Curtis Samuel was like their only weapon. And granted, the defenses were a lot better, especially Ohio State's defense was a lot better than the current version of it. But it proved the point. The wins and losses, they matter, but there is context. I don't think you can judge Ryan Day on just losing to Michigan alone, right? There's some context to it. I think the past two Michigan teams, I think, have been the best two Michigan teams since maybe the early 2000s, right? I think those teams were maybe the same caliber. So I just think you have to keep that in context. That being said, I think Ohio State blew it against Michigan. I thought Ryan Day, again, coached not to lose, and I think it bit him. And I think we saw Ryan Day unleashed against Georgia, and I think everybody was like, where has this been? Because I think that version of Ohio State beats Michigan. But he's clamped up the past two Michigan games. And for that alone, he's beaten everybody else, right? He's beaten everybody else. He's gotten to the playoff 3 times. He's made a championship game. So, his resume is superb, right? Except for Michigan. And, that's what he's going to be judged by, especially in the conference. And if he's losing to Michigan and Michigan's winning the Big Ten, then Ryan Day can't be the best coach in the Big Ten. Which leads me to my number one coach in the Big Ten, as much as it pains me as a Buckeye, is Jim Harbaugh. I have been saying it for years. When people were saying that Jim Harbaugh was overrated, they shouldn't be the head coach, that they should let him go, they should let him walk. He's weird. He's maybe a little socially inept, but the man can coach. He can coach, and he can coach his butt off. All right? 25-3 the past 2 years. 2 playoff berths. 2 wins over Ohio State. The first win in Columbus since, I believe, the year 2000. He is doing things in Michigan that they haven't seen in over 2 decades. And quite honestly, if they weren't a little too puffed up, they would have probably made a national championship game where they would have gotten beat by Georgia. But, make no mistake about it, J.J. McCarthy's talking about national championships. A few years ago, we would have laughed at that. Not anymore. Michigan is a power. And while I think they are, talent-wise, still a step below Ohio State, Georgia, and Alabama, and they are, talent-wise, they are below Ohio State. But in terms of development, in terms of actual win-loss record, Harbaugh is the best coach. And right now, I don't think it's close. Because I think Jim Harbaugh is doing more with less, and he's ruling the conference right now. So that's my Big Ten coaching rankings. I got Harbaugh 1, Ryan Day 2, Franklin 3, Bielema 4, Fickell 5, Kirk Ferentz 6, PJ Fleck 7. PJ Fleck, not Flex. He would like that, wouldn't he? Anyway, Matt Rhule 8, Mel Tucker 9, Mike Loxley 10, Greg Schiano 11, Pat Fitzgerald 12, Tom Allen 13, Ryan Walters 14. That's it. What do you guys think? Let me know. Let me know in a review. Shoot me an email. Let me know what you think. Tweet at me. Big Ten Football Talk on Twitter. Instagram. Check us out on the gram. Big Ten Football Talk. This is Zach Guggenheim signing off. Take care. God bless.